Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Our lecturer this morning is Richard MacMaster, who all of you know. He's one of our favorite lecturers. But I'm not sure, I know it's been a long time since we've really introduced Richard. And so I'm going to try to correct that today and tell you a little bit about our speaker. Richard graduated from Fordham University and got his PhD in history from Georgetown. After he got his PhD, he spent 2 years as an archivist at Gunston Hall at George Mason University. Now, Gunston Hall is one of the preeminent libraries specializing in colonial history. And while he was there, he did kind of a deep dive research on the history of the whole Mason family, going back to England. And that resulted in the publishing of a very successful book entitled The Five Masons. And that book is still in circulation. It's in its second publication, and you can get it on Amazon. After the publishing of The Five Masons, Richard went on to teaching, researching, and publishing, at first at Western Carolina University, then at Bluffton College in Ohio, and finally at George Mason University in Virginia, right?
James Madison.
Or James Madison, yes. Right. James Madison is just up the road or down the road from Charlottesville and the University of Virginia. He retired from James Madison in 1993, and they embarked on what I think you could call a second career. He did work on many projects in Northern Ireland and lived a good deal of time there. For 8 years, he was co-editor of the Journal of Scotch and Irish Studies. So he really branched out after retiring from James Madison. In 2001, he moved to Gainesville, where his wife Eve had accepted a position as pastor of the Emmanuel Mennonite Church here. He soon became active in many of the social causes here in Gainesville, and that resulted in the formation of the Interfaith Alliance for Immigrant Justice, which is a coalition of 14 Gainesville churches, synagogues, and mosques, and they focused their attention on supporting Florida migrant farm workers and branched out into a lot of more immigration issues in general. In 2016, he was a key player in forming Welcoming Gainesville and Welcoming Alachua County, and affiliating those groups with Welcoming America. He was president of Welcoming Gainesville for 2 years, and he's still on the board. An active player in that organization and many of the social activities around that. He's one of our favorite presenters. He's had a distinguished and richly varied career, and he brings that background material to us when he brings his lectures here, and we really appreciate it. Richard's speaking today on the 250th anniversary of actions taken in the UK to abolish the English slave trade. Richard?
Good. As far as I know, I'm not actually dead, but I appreciated your eulogy. Thank you very much. So we're going to be talking about the Mansfield decision in the case of Somerset versus Stewart that was decided in 1772. and we'll tell this story. We have this nice picture here, so let me just tell you what that's about. This is we'll come to what's the actual event is in the course of the story. This is Granville Sharp. Let me get it a little closer. Thank you.
We could put it flat.
That'll do. You can all hear me now. As I say, we have this nice picture here. This is a Victorian artist's idea of how it would have happened. And in one of several cases that Granville Sharp, the man in the light tan coat there in the middle, was instrumental in bringing in the courts, after the decision had been made and his client was freed, this being his client over there on the right, the Sharp himself then did as it were, a citizen's arrest of the captain of the ship that was to take that man back to Jamaica, and arrested him for false imprisonment. And he won that case. So this is and he called on the members of the court as witnesses. And so the rather hapless ship captain there is in the toils of the law. And the rescued man doesn't look all that happy. I don't know why he doesn't, but that was some Victorian artist's idea. Well, let's move on. All right. In the month of July, 1765, a 15 or 16-year-old boy named Jonathan Strong, who had recently come from a plantation in Barbados to London, was taken or took himself to a church and was baptized. A few days later, David Lyle, who was a London attorney and absentee plantation owner, savagely beat Jonathan for whatever reason we don't know. He didn't have to have a reason. Under the law in Barbados, there was only a tiny fine if you killed a slave in a rage. You were just angry at him because he didn't bring your coat or your glass of Madeira on time. You could kill him and, pay a little fine and go on with your life. So David Lyle was inured to this. David Lyle beat this boy so savagely that he had lost the sight of one eye, he had a broken leg, he had fractured ribs and all kinds of other injuries in his arms and legs. And Lyle had him thrown out in the street to die, as though he were a dead or dying dog. And somehow or other, the boy got himself to William Sharp, who did not live too far from Lyle. So he could have crawled there. He could have had some passerby help him there. William Sharp was a very distinguished surgeon at St. Bartholomew's Hospital in London, but he also ran a free clinic for the poor in his house. So people were coming all the time to Sharp's house to be treated. And William Sharp naturally took this young man in and did everything he could to bring him back to life. As a matter of fact, he arranged for him to spend 4 weeks in St. Bartholomew's Hospital, and he paid all the bills himself. William Sharp was one of an incredibly close-knit family. They were the sons and daughters of a clergyman and grandchildren of the Archbishop of York. And they, as I say, they were incredibly close-knit. They enjoyed each other's company. In the 1770s, not more than 10 years after the event we're dealing with right now, William Sharp, Dr. Sharp, had this painting of his siblings, and if you notice in there, there's a little girl who must be a niece, and she's holding a kitten. And right in the center of the picture, you'll recognize him, is Granville. Well, Granville happened to be in William Sharp's clinic on the day that Jonathan Strong was brought in. And it opened his eyes to the horrors of slavery, that a man who owned another man could beat him, kill him, do anything he wanted. And it made him a lifelong opponent of slavery. Here's Granville as a somewhat older person. He was a grand old man of abolition for a great many years, living on into the 19th century, dying 1813. Oh, let's go back for a minute here. We'll leave Granville there. So, Granville was an interesting fellow. He was what we might call a civil servant. He was responsible for ordnance and based at the Tower of London. And in the 18th century, as you know, how different from today, it was important not so much what you knew as who you knew. And if you had an influential enough patron, you could have a virtual sinecure that paid very well and left you a lot of time for other occupations. And Sharp was devoted to his work as the clerk of ordnance for the government, but he also had time to write on English grammar. He was an expert in both biblical Hebrew and New Testament Greek, and some of his voluminous writings on word usage in the scriptures, in the Masoretic text of the Hebrew Bible and in the Koine Greek Bible, that are still cited. There is such a thing as Sharp's rule, that is a way of determining the use of particles in the Greek. So he was a scholar there, and he was also a scholar of the law. He was not a practicing attorney, but he knew everything that a very good attorney would know. So he set himself, now that he was on the path of opposing slavery and looking into the legislation, well, there wasn't legislation, but the precedents in English common law. And it turns out that in 1709, roughly 55 years before this time, a decision had been made that lacking a local law, that is, an act of parliament, there could be no such thing as a slave in England. But though that particular precedent had been challenged in two other cases, one in 1729 and one in 1749, that protected the rights of property. So if I, according to those decisions, if I owned Jonathan Sharp in Barbados and I brought him to London, his status didn't change. He was still my slave, my property. So Sharp wanted to get a case that would reinstate the 1709 decision and determine that without an act of parliament authorizing slavery, there was no such thing as a slave in England. So he's going to be working at that. Now, I'm skipping ahead now, but the 1765, after Jonathan Strong had been healed as best he could be, I mean, he was still pretty well banged up, the Sharps found him a job and a place to live with a Quaker apothecary, a pharmacist in London, and he was clerking in the store and occasionally running errands for his employer. And 2 years later, Lyle happened to see Jonathan Strong on the street. Hadn't been looking for him, but there he was. So he had him arrested and promptly sold him to James Carr, a planter in Jamaica, and wanted to send him to the West Indies. All right. Sharp had him released and brought a case for false imprisonment to the Lord Mayor's Court. That was the opening picture that we saw there. And the decision by the Lord Mayor of London, which I think I have coming right up. No. Was, this is a quote, "The lad had not stolen anything and was not guilty of any offense and was therefore at liberty to go away." So goodbye, Lyle, goodbye, Carr. And Sharp won his case. This is a picture of the slave trade. I think a 19th century artist. Let's move. Well, all right, let's go back for a minute. No, that's fine. That's fine. We'll just leave it there for a moment. All right, now, Sharp wanted more than just liberating one individual. He wanted to see slavery done away with. And as a result, he'd been working on, let's see, I think it's coming right up. He had been working on a book, really the first book-length publication in English challenging the whole institution of slavery. And it wasn't published until 1769, but he'd been at it for quite some time. And it was in this book that he makes it clear that he wants to have slavery abolished by saying that there is no law in England to protect it. So he picked up several cases, all right. In 1768, a woman named Mary, who was an African slave was married to a free black Englishman. And Sharp intervened in this case and got her freed. She was actually on a ship going to Jamaica, and they got her off the ship. Apparently it hadn't sailed down the Thames yet. They got her off the ship and reunited with her husband. And on the grounds that in English common law, husband and wife were one person. So if my wife and I are one person, you can't take my wife away from me. So Mary has to come back and be freed. But that, again, that just freed one person. What about getting all the way with this? There is another case, before we get to this one, let's hang on this. There is another case that came up in 1770. And this was a man named Thomas Lewis, who was apparently a free man, or had lived as a free man for a while, but was claimed as a slave by his owner or previous owner who had never legally freed him. And in this case, Sharp was able to win the case by arguing that the owner was unable to prove his property, that he didn't have irrefutable proof that this is actually my slave, and here are the documents that say I own him. So he freed that man, but he still hasn't done what he wants to do. So we move on to this case. And this case was initiated by James Somerset himself, who called on Granville Sharp and said that, well, you can read some of this, that Charles Stuart would have to prove that Somerset was his property. But Sharp wanted to widen the issue. There was the question of whether anyone should be able to forcibly remove another person from England. Now, James Somerset was coming from that hotbed of plantation slavery known as Boston, Massachusetts, where in 1771 there were slaves and they were legally there. So in December 1771, Mansfield was petitioned for a writ of habeas corpus. It stated that a black man, James Somerset, was being held on board a ship that was about to sail to Jamaica and that he must be released. And Sharp had assembled a blue ribbon panel of 5 barristers to defend James Somerset, and all of them worked pro bono. They were all convinced that this was something that should be done. Oh, now let's get this got a little bit out of line here. Let's see what comes up next. Well, this will do. So the decision is not made until June 1772. And the interesting thing about it is that unlike some of the earlier cases, this was a media event. The English papers were full of day-to-day reports of what was going on in Somerset versus Stuart, and Mansfield continually delaying the decision. But it made the whole population very aware of that. And as you know, newspapers in the American colonies were made up, usually the first 2 pages, of clips from English newspapers. So people in the American colonies were also following this case and what would happen to this man who had come from Massachusetts to England. Was he still a slave when he was in England? Let's see what comes up next. This is the previous, that's Mansfield, by the way. This is the previous case. The owner couldn't prove his property. That is Lord Mansfield. Now, the case of James Somerset, a Negro, on a habeas corpus in the King's Bench in 1771, 1772. All right. So this is all the background to the case. So the decision came down that indeed there was no act of Parliament that authorized slavery in England. But like any legal decision, it can be construed in various ways. And Mansfield made it a fairly narrow decision. That is, that on that grounds, no one could be forced to, on the excuse that they were slaves, no one could be forced to go on board a ship and be taken into slavery somewhere where it was legal. So on the one hand, it established that the idea that you had, what to use 19th century American terms, that you had free soil England and slave colonies, but it did not immediately free anybody in England. If I owned a slave, well, I guess I still owned him, unless I wanted to send him back to one of the plantations. I'm not sure what's coming up next. Oh yeah, here's the state of the case, and it was published immediately in 1772 in full. And if you read the title here, this is an argument in the case of James Somerset, lately determined by the Court of King's Bench. And I can't quite read that small print, but the present unlawfulness of domestic slavery in England, to which is appended a state of the case by one of the counsel, one of the 5 men who worked for Sharp. So, yes, it said the present unlawfulness of domestic slavery in England, but it didn't quite free anybody who happened to be a slave at that time. Now here's Sharp again. What's happening here? Well, this is interesting. When Mansfield due to give his verdict, there was a mixed and excited crowd of spectators. The ruling was celebrated by hundreds, and people saw it as slavery being outlawed in England, but Mansfield later restated he meant only to curtail one of the more abusive powers of slave owners, not outlaw slavery. More important, James Somerset was treated as an equal citizen, and his right to habeas corpus was upheld. That is Josiah Wedgwood's medallion that he created for the anti-slavery cause, Am I Not a Man and a Brother? Now, in 1772, right after this, John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, although he remained in the Church of England to his death, wrote Thoughts Upon Slavery. He was one of many people who took from the Mansfield decision a strong desire to eliminate both slavery and immediately the slave trade. And Wesley was a kind of record-breaking publisher. So hundreds and thousands of these things were scattered all over the American colonies and all over England, and helped with the movement. I forget what's coming up next. So, did the Somerset decision end slavery in England? If it did or it didn't, what it did do was to begin an enormous movement that had spread from some of the groups like the Quakers, to who had just begun to see the evil of slavery in the 1770s, to a wide population. And it will lead to a movement to end the slave trade. So it's a very significant decision in that way, that slavery, if not totally abolished by the Mansfield decision, was now, in Britain at least, on its last legs. And in 1778, just 6 years later, the Scottish courts came down with, they have a separate law in Scotland, or they did, I guess they still do. They came down with a decision that in fact said there could be no such thing as slavery in Scotland. So it had a great influence, and that was quite important. I forget what's coming up next. So some pictures of petition to end the slave trade. These are contemporary pictures from around 1800. And William Wilberforce, who was only a boy when the Mansfield decision was handed down, would by the end of the 1780s, as a very young member of Parliament, introduce the first bill to totally outlaw the slave trade. And in its first reading in Parliament, it received exactly one vote. But he kept with it, and John Wesley's last letter, he died in 1791, was to encourage Wilberforce to keep on with the fight until we win. And ultimately, of course, in 1807, he did. So, well, we'll go back here. Now, I've got some more things I wanted to say if I haven't. Yeah, we've got some time here. Excellent. And that is, what was its effect in America? The American newspapers carried stories about this, and James Somerset himself was from one of the American colonies, the continental colonies, Massachusetts. So, excuse me, did it have an effect here? And it's not quite what we might expect. Even though it was in the newspapers, I attended a symposium. I attended by Zoom, the wonders of Zoom, that you could go to things that happened in Philadelphia or Belfast and be there when, I could never get that far. But one of the participants pointed out that he had found in the Virginia Gazette in 1773, perhaps, an advertisement for a runaway slave that said that this man is trying to get to England where he believes he will be free when he gets there, which sounds exactly like in the slave cabins in Virginia, some people knew about the Somerset decision, and some people were prepared to act on it. And we may, this gets into a second thing about the American side, the degree to which African Americans had agency. Historically, we tended to think of abolition as a movement of very decent white people like the Sharps, the Wilberforces, and so on, and Wesleys. But was there actually some agency on the part of the blacks themselves? And the second idea that in America they might have had some agency was the very large number of escaped slaves who rallied to the British cause when Lord Dunmore issued an act of abolishing slavery, freeing slaves who came into the British lines. And they ended up evacuating more than 20,000 black veterans of the war and taking them to Nova Scotia and New England and also to the Bahamas. And was that a result of this? Did the folks, this was confined almost entirely to the Chesapeake, did the folks who were enslaved in the Chesapeake area say, oh yes, if we get to the British, we'll be free? Perhaps they did. But the long run is, I just have a few more things I want to rattle at you, all right? The long run was that no, it didn't really have any effect directly and immediately in the American colonies in North America. The one, two things. One is that although the British merchants fought tooth and nail to preserve the slave trade, beginning about 1774, there was a strong movement in the Chesapeake area to abolish the slave trade. And in the Declaration of Independence, there is a statement that one of the crimes of the king was that he forced this odious trade on his American subjects. And the argument there is possibly that these folks were concerned with the horrors of the trade. Some of them surely were, but at the same time, it was an economic interest that if you cut off the supply of fresh slaves, then the slaves in the Chesapeake region would be more valuable and could be sold at a better price to South Carolina or Georgia, but were being, their settlements were expanding at that time. And secondly, then, there was a period during the American Revolution and immediately thereafter when there was a movement actually here, generally not in the southern states, to end slavery. And in 1784, Dr. Thomas Cook, who was John Wesley's representative in organizing the Methodist people in America at a conference in Baltimore, at Christmas time, 1784, he committed the Methodists to an anti-slavery campaign and introduced legislation in the Virginia Assembly that would gradually free all the slaves in Virginia. And they collected, and then we still have these petitions in the state library in Richmond. They collected a whole bunch of petitions signed by people all around, especially in the Shenandoah Valley and places where there really wasn't very much dependence on slavery, calling for the end of slavery. The petitions were rejected by the Assembly with contempt, that they were not to be laid on the table, but thrown under the table. And that was the end of that. But in the course of that campaign, Dr. Cook called on people like George Washington and James Madison and George Mason and asked them to support the drive to end slavery. And all of them, without exception, told him, "Oh, we deplore slavery. Terrible, terrible, terrible. We wish we didn't depend on it." But no one of them was willing to be identified with a petition to end slavery. So it was something like people talking about fossil fuels today. Oh, it's terrible, but do I really want to give it up? No, thank you. So I want to quote my friend George Mason of Gunston Hall. In 1787, at the Constitutional Convention, when they drew up the final Constitution that we know today, Mason, who had a number of objections, walked out. He took Governor Randolph by the arm, and the Virginia delegation walked out. They later on ratified the document, of course. And one of the things that Mason said was that in the Constitution, they did what they ought not to have done, and they did not do what they ought to have done. And what they did that they ought not to have done was to authorize and protect the slave trade until 1808, 20 years of the protected slave trade at the demand of the delegates from Georgia and South Carolina. And what they did not do, that they should have done, according to Mason, was to have a provision protecting the institution of slavery. In other words, putting in the Constitution that specific law that said, you and I can own another human being as our property and nobody can challenge it. So as I wind up now, I just wanted to throw out the idea that if we push that into the 19th century, if Mason had gotten that line in the Constitution, would we have had a civil war? There would be no reason why the states would be free soil. There couldn't be such a thing. There was a law establishing slavery anywhere that I owned a slave. So it's sort of a contrary to fact history there, but it's an interesting idea. And it means that Mansfield decision was really an important and very important statement in English law. So I think you've
Thank
heard
you.
enough from me.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. Thank you. Are there any questions? Anybody?
Yes, we went to the front there.
Yeah. Yes, sure.
Two.
This is more of a comment, is that I was scrolling through Amazon the other day, and they currently are offering a long, like 15-hour session on slavery.
In what?
It's a 15-hour, it's like 30 episodes on the history of slavery on Amazon Prime.
Oh, yes, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Richard, I had one question. In England, what we've been talking about here was the subject of ownership of slaves. But England was also a leader in the slave trade itself, weren't they? And did this activity that was going on around the freedom of individuals, how did that impact England's role in the slave trade itself?
Legally, I don't think it had the slightest impact. It's interesting that around 2007, which was the bicentennial of the abolition of the slave trade by the British Parliament, there was a great deal of research and writing on the slave trade. The two great ports for the slave trade, and it's staggering how big a role they had, were Bristol and Liverpool. The whole economy of those places turned on the slave trade. But the kind of research that came out was that there was not a port so small and so insignificant that somehow or other in the 18th century, some businessman in that port didn't get into the slave trade. So the slave trade fueled, and I think this is pretty well established, fueled the Industrial Revolution in Britain. It was an enormous operation, and it churned up enormous amounts of money and crushed the lives of enormous numbers of people.
Yeah.
But anyway,
yeah, and
we had a question here.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Yes. When England finally abolished slavery, did that extend to its colonies, such as Barbados that you were referring to?
They didn't finally abolish slavery until 1833. Oh, until 1833. Took a long time. And that was a compensated emancipation where actually I'm coming back in May to pick up on that particular point, that the abolition of slavery in 1833 released the slaves in the British Empire, but only to be apprentices, that they would need to be controlled by their former owners in most cases. So it was a kind of very imperfect freedom. And the individuals who had owned slaves were all compensated at the full market rate that the slaves were worth at the time. And so they had an awful lot of money that was poured then from the government into the British economy to invest, in many cases, in American railroads, in manufacturing, and all sorts of things. A friend of mine who is a Church of England minister was shocked to discover when there's a database you can find who got what on this whole thing, that the money that built the church that he serves, and an endowment for that church, because it was a church that served a very poor area, came from a woman who owned, perhaps in part, a plantation in the West Indies and was paid for her slaves and didn't want to have that dirty money. So she gave it all to the church to cleanse her conscience. But he was wondering, am I being paid out of the slave labor of poor people in the West Indies many, many years ago?
Anything else? This has been fascinating, Richard. Thank you. And as you said, you're coming back to pick up on this story in the next semester.
Yeah.
And we'll all look forward to that.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much for being with us today, and thank you to Richard.
Thank you. Thank you all.